So I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to 1910. That's easier for some than others, I appreciate. A New York accountant called James Marwick is crossing the Atlantic to visit his newly opened Paris office. During the crossing, he encounters William Barclay Peat, and over the 6-day voyage, the two men find they have much in common. Not only did both men run accounting firms, but more importantly, they had a shared perspective on professional values. On the 8th of October 1910, Peat and Marwick agreed to merge aboard that ship. That ship was called the Lusitania, and that firm, if you roll forward 110 years, still stands today as KPMG. And Richard, I expect you might be familiar with that story, as I know your early career was spent with Peat Marwick, albeit I'm not suggesting quite as early as 1910. But for me, the point of that story is that serendipity is not a strategy. And whilst, as we can see, serendipitous meetings can have a positive outcome, if growth through M&A is a part of your growth strategy, it's essential to invest in the planning, the research, and origination process. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll briefly explore two areas: the drivers of firms who've developed a strategy for growth, and then what those firms are looking for from those targets. The reality is that the drivers have, and I think will remain the same for a very long time. So depending on the size and the profile of your firm, it may well be that the pandemic has perhaps exacerbated some of the drivers that we're familiar with, such as increases in professional indemnity insurance or challenges around poor performing practice groups, and maybe a reliance on underperforming sector or particular clients, and even increasing regulatory and compliance burdens that so many firms face. But other familiar drivers include things like succession planning and differentiation, which I'd like to come back to. In terms of priorities for growth, we generally distill these down into 4 areas: so geography, sectors, practice areas, and expertise, and then reflect on those as opportunities for growth through whether that's entering new markets, growing existing markets, consolidating existing markets, or reinforcing those markets. And ultimately, the firm's drivers will be influenced by its owners and a combination of their personal circumstances and their ambition, the ambition perhaps of the wider ownership or leadership group. So coming back to the point about differentiation, the challenge is, how do owners go about differentiating their firm and future-proofing their business in what is an increasingly competitive landscape? So many firms are acutely aware of the changing shape and complexity of our market in which they operate. And in order to sustain that future, they're really considering opportunities to scale through M&A, and whether that's growing a business through acquisition or potentially merging up into a larger firm. To my mind, there needs to be a really clear reason for a merger. For example, merging two 20 million revenue firms does increase scale, potentially footprint. It doesn't necessarily increase service lines or the ability to serve more complex clients, but what you now have is a 40 million pound firm competing against the same firms for the same clients, with perhaps a slightly better margin if costs have been taken out. So as for what a firm's looking for in targets, if the focus is growth and stability, the outcome of any of these routes must be to obtain mutual leverage across practice areas in order to retain existing clients and serve new ones, financial security, a broader market offering, and an increased client base. And there are undoubtedly similar strategies being played out across the UK and further afield. So in the last few months, we've seen Waitman's merge with Radcliffe's Librasa, Royds Willie King merge with Goodman Derrick, DMH Stallard merge with Griffith Smith, and Knights PLC have acquired Langley's. And all of these transactions, to my mind, have geographical implications, whether that's reinforcing an existing presence or perhaps opening a new door and new opportunities. So in terms of what the firm's looking for, profitable growth unfailingly underpins every M&A strategy. Profitable firms who are robustly governed in relation to finance and compliance, and who would consider being acquired, which I think is a really important point, are really highly sought after at the minute. And finally, as the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So start with finding someone you like. Thanks, Richard.